A decade ago, all the talk about China was of strategic partnerships and a bright trading future. How times have changed. Over the past decade, covering China for the Toronto Star, the South China Morning Post, among others, Joanna Chiu has had a front row seat to the dramatic shift in relations with Canada and many others. She chronicles that in her new book. It's called China Unbound, A New World Disorder. And it brings Joanna Chiu to our virtual studio from Vancouver, British Columbia. It's great to have you back on TVO. Joanna, how are you doing?
Thanks so much, Steve, for having me on and highlighting the book.
Not at all. I'll tell you, I read it, obviously, and it is a very disquieting look at where things are at nowadays. So let's get into this. I want to start asking you a question that you pose in the book. Quote, with China on the rise, what kind of global leader would it make if it became the world's most powerful economy? Want to take a kick at that answer?
Yeah, so my family history is so bound up in what has happened with China and Hong Kong in the last decades. We actually went to Canada because of fear over the upcoming takeover of Hong Kong in 1997 after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. So growing up, I was always looking at China from Canada, from this very privileged position I had growing up in Vancouver, and interested in human rights and the development of civil society and the economy in China. So I started reporting in Greater China in 2012, and I wasn't expecting that there would be increasing crackdowns in civil society. Back in 2012, when the current President Xi Jinping came to power, there was actually a lot of optimism about how he would steer China into perhaps a more liberal direction. But instead, the opposite happened. And unfortunately, I had a front row seat as the country sort of veered towards this direction where it was just instilling fear in so many of very moderate critics, including human rights lawyers. There were multiple cases where I was speaking with sources in China, lawyers or activists, and they would suddenly stop responding to me because they had been detained into the system of secret policing. So unfortunately, right now in Beijing, if you're anywhere in that sphere where you could be seen as a critic, where you are perhaps a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy, you could face some pretty serious consequences. And increasingly, I think the world is paying attention because not only Chinese citizens, but foreign nationals, foreign citizens, are getting swept up in this reality of increasing crackdowns under President Xi.
Well, in fact, you say in the book, quote, China is thin-skinned. It threatens anyone who seems to have hurt its pride. And in many ways, you say China is very sensitive. Why would such a powerful force in the world be so thin-skinned in your view?
I try to provide a lot of nuance and historical context in the book because I think without looking at the wider picture, what we see happening can be kind of baffling. Why is China's foreign ministry lashing out at mildest statements from the UN or countries like Canada or the US? So I go into as concisely and succinctly as possible the last 100 and more years, including the century of humiliation, which that time is known as in China, that encompasses the two opium wars where Britain and the Allied powers basically forced the opening of trade in China, basically forced the sale of opium drugs to Chinese people because the West wanted Chinese goods like silk and tea so badly and was frustrated that the Chinese didn't seem to want any Western goods in return. So basically manufacturing this countrywide addiction to opium. Things like this, they run really deep. It's deeply humiliating. And it's good to remember that China still continues to be a developing country where many people live in poverty. And Beijing is really committed to trying to increase the wealth of the country overall. So also coming from this place where there is anxiety internally about the economy and that people who might fail to climb up, the ladder and get richer might eventually stop being as loyal or supportive to the party. There's a lot of both historical anxiety and also current anxiety about the stability of the domestic economy and the support CCP gets from its own citizens.
Let me follow up on that because, we in the West tend to think when we put ourselves in the world, we tend to look back at least 5 or 10 minutes at our history before we consider our place in the world today. In other words, we don't look back much at all. How important is it for us to remember that for the Chinese government, to be sure, but also a significant chunk of the Chinese population, these century-old humiliations are important today, and we need to take that into account when we think about relations with this country. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think it just provides context because a lot of people are worried right now about Beijing's rise and influence in the world. But I think people also overestimate the type of hostility that is involved. When you look at Beijing's actual actions, they are still showing up to international summits. They're still taking calls from world leaders. They're not seeming to be interested in isolating themselves. In fact, I don't think they have a choice because with globalization, China joined the World Trade Organization, its economy is so integrated and central to the world. So what I question is whether Western governments and societies are using these avenues of engagement well, whether it comes from a place where there is informed understanding of China's domestic situation and its foreign policy goals and what it's doing around the world in trying to cross over borders and surveil, monitor, and stifle criticism overseas. In the research for my book, where I focus on Western countries and I traveled around Europe, Australia, the US, Canada, the main theme and feedback I got from people is that they've been warning about some of Beijing's international influence efforts for decades. But it's only been recently where what happened in Canada with the two Michaels being taken brazenly as hostages, where it seemed more of the mainstream public and Western society has started being concerned and didn't just look at China as a potential huge economic market, but that there are complex political realities as well, and definitely a chip on shoulders of Chinese leaders where they are seeming to overreact to criticism and to pressure from the West.
Obviously, we are going to talk about the two Michaels in a few moments' time, but while you have raised the issue of China basically trying to make friends all over the world as it relates to business with its New Silk Road Initiative, et cetera, there's a comment here. A prominent Greek businessman that you spoke to called China, quote, a modern-day colonizer. And he said the Chinese found out that by financing the infrastructure of the countries, you conquer them. Do you think that's a fair knock?
Well, I actually interrogate those assumptions. And what was interesting was that in Greece, this prominent businessman, he's actually head of the Chamber of Commerce there, is that he thought China was a colonizer, but he didn't think that was a bad thing. To him, money was power, and China having money meant that it was right to have more respect and control in the places in the countries where it was providing loans, including, of course, Greece. So that kind of complicates things because he welcomed Chinese state investment in Athens port, taking over the port and the trade flows there. It was, on a large part, actually quite welcome on the ground among Greeks. And we don't see that kind of narrative, perhaps that's more prominent in the US and in Australia, where investments from China are, things to be suspicious of.
Well, here's the voice of China answering back. This is from a state-run organ called Global Times. And here's the comment. Canada, the UK, and Australia, 3 members of the Five Eyes Alliance, have recently taken action to put pressure on China. They have formed a US-centered, racist, and mafia-styled community, willfully and arrogantly provoking China and trying to consolidate their hegemony as all gangsters do. They are becoming a racist axis aimed at stifling the development rights of 1.4 billion Chinese. The formation of 4 states, except the UK, is the result of British colonization. Those countries share the Anglo-Saxon civilization. With a common language, a common historical background, and a coordinated attack target, such an axis is destined to erode international relations and allow hooliganism to rise to the diplomatic stage. Global diplomacy in the 21st century must not be hijacked by a fake international community with an axis of white supremacy. I hear you laughing, but that's axis of white supremacy. What do you make of that kind of language?
Well, just to provide a disclaimer, like the Global Times is perhaps the most hawkish and belligerent state-affiliated tabloid in China. Perhaps it's not entirely a direct mouthpiece from Beijing officials, but definitely it reflects perhaps a portion of the Chinese leadership, if not generally. I did, living in Beijing, speak with much more thoughtful people than what you would assume from the editorials that the Global Times regularly produces, or even the statements that the official foreign ministry regularly puts out. But what's interesting in that statement is it reflects some of the main talking points that the CCP uses to try to discredit international criticism. Canada, and along with other states, have been trying to work more on a multilateral level to put pressure on Beijing against what is happening, like the internment of around 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps in Xinjiang. Countries feel that speaking as a group, they have a stronger voice than alone, which I think makes a lot of sense. But Beijing is trying to shape this and make it seem like a racist attack, that any criticism of China is racist. And they're really, really deliberately trying to encourage conflation of the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion Chinese people, citizens, and the Chinese state. What is concerning to me is that while this seems ridiculous when you see it, flash across the screen, many people in the West do conflate Chinese people and the Chinese state. Former President Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he thinks all international students from China are spies, that they should be treated as spies. And scientists in the US have been persecuted and, found that there was no basis to these persecutions. And a lot of experts on China worry that this Red Scare, this conflation of the CCP and the Chinese people, is playing into what Beijing most wants to see. It wants to paralyze more productive and nuanced dialogue in the West by making it seem as if this is a racist attack that is just going to stoke xenophobia. Unfortunately, in the West, we haven't been very nuanced in showing that that's not what they're saying. We're not conflating the people of the states. And in my reporting, I draw on decades of warnings and testimonials from people of Chinese descent in countries like Canada, where they've been trying to warn that Beijing has been trying to do this, trying to support these narratives. But time and again, they have been ignored. They've been ignored now. They continue to feel very just not supported. Myself, when I have reported on human rights in Xinjiang and received hundreds of threatening messages, going to the police, they tell me there's nothing they could do, talking to the Bill Blair's office and Ministry of Public Safety. Meanwhile, they say Canadians who feel concerned about threats from foreign sources should go to the police. But when people go to the police say there's nothing they can do. So it's kind of a circular response people get from authorities that make them feel really unsupported, and that it's playing into this myth that people of Chinese descent are this homogenous group that all support what Beijing is doing, which isn't true.
You just used the word nuance there in that answer, and I think, if memory serves, about 3/4 of the way through the book, you talk about the fact that we're not living in times where we do nuance very well, and these are times in which maybe being able to act on a global stage with a little more nuance would be very helpful. What do we do about that?
So the cabinet in the U.S. Canada just had a reshuffling of the cabinet. But in general, people tell me that they worry there's not enough expertise on China advising governments. The Liberal Party in Canada, and definitely, many ruling parties in Canada, most of their advisors in China have been people in the business world, where, of course, they have really valuable lived experiences doing business in China, but they also have vested interests, and they also have interests in making sure that relations are as friendly as possible so it doesn't affect a business relationship. So people spoke to me of this assumption that Western countries like Canada could approach China with kind of dual track diplomacy. On the one hand, they could bring up human rights and bring up civil rights. And on the other hand, they can just aggressively expand economic and trade ties as much as possible, and those tracks will not cross. But that kind of assumption came crashing down in recent years when Beijing has done more acts of economic coercion or retaliation. So after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the request of US authorities, Beijing stopped importing Canadian canola and pork products for quite some time, as very clearly a way to put pressure on Canada to release Meng. And so that was done in conjunction with taking the two Michaels as hostages. And now, because they were released the same day that Meng was, it's very clear that they were in fact political pawns. So a lot of Western countries, the lesson they should take from that is it's not possible to have this kind of arrogant view where the West can only benefit from China's rise without thinking about political dimensions or that there could be repercussions on its people.
Well, since you've raised the two Michaels, let's follow up on it here. You're a friend of Michael Kovrig's, are you not?
Yes, I knew him personally in Beijing, and many journalists and diplomats and people who lived there at the time knew him. He was very social and friendly to everyone.
Have you been in touch with him since he's returned home?
I've been in touch with his family, but he is trying to take some time for himself and to obviously adjust back to what must be a very strange reality coming back to Canada as the global pandemic is continuing.
That sounds like a very sensible thing for him to do. Given how this situation transpired over the 3 years, more than 3 years that it did, what do you think is the single most important thing we learned about dealing with China as a result of the two Michaels situation?
What I get struck by in years of reporting on human rights is that individual lives and liberties isn't of great concern to China's top leaders. They've been incarcerating people for all sorts of reasons, including teenage bloggers who spread rumors about Chinese leaders that authorities did not like, including lawyers, like I mentioned, whose only crime was doing their jobs, basically taking cases of farmers who lost their land or Christian pastors who were stopped from preaching. So not only the two Michaels, but so many people have lost their freedom and basic human rights, I would say, from basically just whims of Chinese authorities who have been trying to basically crack down on all levels of civil society. Even the CCP says it supports women's rights, but a few years ago it arrested 5 feminists, and for the reason that they were attempting or planning to give out stickers on public transit to raise awareness about sexual harassment on buses and trains. So something like that is seen as a potential threat to Beijing. So let alone a major crisis, according to Chinese perspective, of its basically royalty, Meng Wanzhou, being taken, which was very humiliating. Of course, they didn't have qualms about trying to take some relatively high-profile Canadians. They're not high-profile in the sense that they were famous, but I think it seemed like there was a deliberate intention to arrest people that, frankly, white people around the world would relate to. And people have said as much to me that they knew that there were political prisoners for decades, including many in the past of Asian descent. But suddenly there were two men who basically looked like them, who looked like their friends, sitting in jail for almost 3 years as essentially political pawns. That really upset a lot of people around the world.
You know, I must confess that as I was reading the book, And as you were giving more and more and more examples of either Chinese nationals who are living here, who are being harassed for whatever reason, numerous examples that you've given from around the world, I kept thinking, is she not worried about her own safety in writing this book? I mean, there's no question the Chinese government's not going to be in love with this book if they read it. Do you worry for yourself?
I think anyone who works on these issues worries for themselves and their families. And it's basically a kind of a dark backdrop of all of us who work on China issues. And as a journalist, I really should be in a position where I shouldn't worry, because everything I write, I try to make it as factual as possible. And, you know, this whole interview in my book, it is as critical of the West for being ignorant or getting China wrong or, you know, acting out of self-interest as it is critical of Beijing.
Joanna, that's true, but I'm not sure the Chinese regime would necessarily note the nuance of that comment.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So a lot of China's actions have been really, to describe it, irrational. It doesn't make sense. Like, I try to provide the nuance and context to try to explain Beijing's actions, but overall, this great sensitivity, it means often China's diplomats and authorities are lashing out. They're not really seeming to make actions from a calm perspective. And that's very concerning, not just for people like me, individuals, but for, you know, global peace in general, when it's in a state of such instability. So it's tough because a lot of journalists have fled China. I worry about the foreign correspondents who are there on the ground still. Some, like a BBC correspondent, received death threats, and that's why he had to move his family out. 2 Australian correspondents got a tip that they were about to be detained in some sort of national security case, so they had to seek refuge at the Australian embassy in Shanghai and Beijing. So it's becoming really dramatic, and journalists and researchers who just want to report on the ground there, or even from overseas like I do, end up, you know, in these situations where they and their families are in danger. Journalists have been separated from their children, being questioned and interrogated. So it is a very tough situation. I'm not planning to go back to China or try to go back to China anytime soon. And definitely it's tough, because if you read the book, you can see how I clearly actually love my time in China and society and the people there. I really try to portray the nuanced perspectives of Chinese people, and including the interviews I was able to get from Chinese officials on background. They didn't want to give me their names, but they're also trying to raise alarm bells about how repressive things have become, where there's basically no room in the political system for there to be opposing voices, for there to be more of a dialogue. President Xi has really consolidated his power. And when I first arrived to my last time reporting on the political congress in March 2018, people used to speak with me, but the last year, people pretended they all had the flu and lost their voice, literally, and weren't able to speak with journalists anymore.
Okay, here's a weird question. You ready for this? Do you know Steve Bannon?
He seems to know me because he made a strange movie based on my work.
Yes, he did. In fact, it's called Claws of the Red Dragon. This is, of course, Donald Trump's former consigliere that we're talking about. I don't know if they're estranged now. They once were. Well, anyway, you've seen yourself on the silver screen. I'm going to let everybody else see you on the silver screen. Sheldon,
no.
Bottom of page 4. Let's go. Clip, please.
They just arbitrarily sentenced a Canadian to death. There's no telling where this retaliation will end.
It would be unfortunate if a few articles published in a Canadian newspaper were to cause such innocent people any difficulties.
This is a democracy. Reporters write the truth, editors allow that truth to be published. The legal system operates without interference, full stop.
Jane, these are serious people, and they know everything about you and your family.
Well, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Bob Woodward, who had, of course, had Robert Redford play him in a motion picture, which is not a bad thing. What's it like to see yourself portrayed on the silver screen?
Well, hope it wasn't screened in theaters. I think it was actually, unfortunately, which is mortifying. But I did not know that this film was in the works until it was announced. And on the website initially, it said it was inspired and based on true story of, Joanna Chiu, a journalist from the East who grew up in the West, who was brave enough to expose the Chinese Communist Party. And Steve Bannon said in interviews that he wanted to screen this to Trump to affect US policy. And the problem with that is that the film included many, many inaccuracies and exaggerations and made things like China's industrial policy to support its companies, Made in China 2025, into this secretive plot to take over the world. And I argue that actually the facts of what Beijing is doing are shocking enough. It's really baffling to me why there's media in the West that actually exaggerates or makes up things about China when, to me, it's more important to focus on what China is actually doing.
In which case, can you tell us just finally whether you think the West and China are inexorably onto a Cold War course now?
I think if it's up to certain forces in the U.S., I spoke with people in the military in the U.S. who worry that there is this direction. There's a lot of kind of war drum beating where some influential people feel that there's some sort of ideological existential crisis that America is facing, where China is really trying to take over and diminish American power in the world as leading superpower. I hope that the more moderate voices in the U.S. will ultimately prevail and put some checks and balances. And there's also responsibility for middle powers like Canada to also be a sober, reasoned, nuanced voice in these conversations. I think a lot of people in Canada have kind of had the assumption that they're not powerful enough to make a change, so better sit back and let Washington steer the show. But that is not the case because Beijing basically dismisses anything that American officials say now. There's limited negotiation and dialogue opportunities between the US and China, whereas other countries might have the ear of influential Chinese officials more so. And if they are getting good information and advice from China experts, they might be able to use those opportunities better to kind of reduce the real possibility of some sort of conflict in the future, not just this war of words that we're seeing and trade war, but an actual military conflict. I think we all have a role to play in trying to keep these avenues of discussion and dialogue open and to express that and to push the view that promoting universal human rights isn't something that the Chinese people don't want.
Well, that word keeps coming up, nuanced. And I can say that this has been an absolutely fascinating, nuanced look at China Unbound, a new world disorder. Joanna Chiu, it's been great having you on the program. And you can tell your cat that he or she obviously wants a cameo. Thank your cat for being as polite as, as it was over the past half an hour. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, Mimi is excited about her, her star showing here. Thank you for having us.
Not at all. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.